Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So a good friend of the channel by the name of Shawarma, he also has his own YouTube channel where you can actually find his narration to this video as well, took his anti-venom to rank 3 Sig 200, and he has been praising him for ages. So the point of this video is to see how anti-venom stacks up with Void over the course of multiples of different matchups, because it is no secret when anti-venom was released, he was definitely kind of, left a bit behind in the hype of now. But as the time goes on, many people have grown more and more kind of in favor with anti-venom. Many people have grown closer to anti-venom in a sense that they start appreciating him more. And Void is always a very kind of great benchmark for a ton of science champions, and how they compete and compare in the current meta, which things, Void does better, which things maybe anti-venom does better, because there are fair bit of similarities in between Void and anti-venom in the fact that, both of them have potent petrifies, even though Void's petrify, specifically speaking, is more potent, but anti-venom has extra things to him. They both have the incinerate immunity, both rely on debuffs, so on and so forth. So, it is going to be quite interesting to see how anti-venom stacks up with Void. So, both of them are rank 3 Sig 200, and he does have his point system, but for most part, if there is about a 15% or bigger difference, then the champion takes a point. And if there is very small relative difference there, then neither champion gets a point. So, I do think I need to shorten the screen here slightly to make it fit better. But that's perfectly fine, not a problem. And here we can see at the moment quite well how both of these fights are going. And we can definitely notice that anti-venom in the damage department is much slower starter. If you are familiar with the way anti-venom works in general, then you will know that virtually all of his damage, which can be quite decent, but virtually all of it lies after level 2. And does require some sort of ramp up. For longer fights, ideally you want to go for a level 3 before you get that level 2, because then you can double up on the amount of furies you have, at which point you'd be hitting very hard. So you can see that at the very beginning of the fight, Void is definitely ahead by like 8 or 9% here. It's not like a huge or massive lead, but as the further the fight's gonna carry on, the more it is going to increase. Now here he goes for a level 1 as well to finish his build up even quicker and get all the 8 debuffs for himself. One of the coolest things about anti-venom is that if you have him at Sig 200, you can virtually block everything and gain significantly more power, and that lets you get your special attacks quicker. So anti-venom, in my opinion, is one of those champions that you do want to get to Sig 200 as well, which is kind of fairly typical for science class. But here we can see that once you have gotten those 8 passive furies, obviously anti-venom just rushes past Void, and he will in fact finish this fight quite significantly quicker. There are 20k medium hits. He's still at like 98-99% of the health, and his regens are still, recovering whatever is left there. He's gonna go for additional level 2 here. He's gonna have 14 furies, 67k crit, sorry, 67k non-crit, so in 2 minutes there. And then Void still has yet to finish off the fight, and he deemed the difference there to be big enough to give the point for anti-venom in terms specifically of just like a straightforward type of damage in a casual fight. So he does turn out to be harder hitting than Void. It would be interesting to see how this would compare in a similar situation if willpower is involved, and heal reversal things would be taken into consideration. But specifically speaking about heal reversal, then there's obviously going to be Wolverine fight here. And one of the bigger things here about the Wolverine fight is quite simply the RNG, and the fact that Void is much more dependent from RNG, even though, for instance, in this fight he got quite lucky with Petrify proccing as the first debuff. You also still obviously have to deal with the Wolverine's RNG. And fact of the matter is, both of these champions are very great when it comes to regen reversal, but anti-venom does at the very least take that regeneration out of equation, because his petrify is guaranteed on level 1, and in virtually almost all of the situations, I think overall his regen reversal will be quicker achieved, because you will be placing debuffs that interact with despair, just by increasing your combo count. But then with every level 1, you're going to be placing additional petrifies, which obviously is going to reverse it even further. And there's no RNG involved in that sense. So strictly for regen reversal speed, Anti-Venom kind of takes it. Now, this fight is against Masochism, and here it's 100% all Void. You can see that the result is so obvious and the difference is so vast that he even had to double up the speed of Anti-Venom's fight, because as long as Masochism is involved, Void has the ability to kind of play around it, bypass it by triggering it in, you know, appropriate times and letting his debuff stick perfectly. And with Anti-Venom, Anti-Venom might be also decent against Masochism, but he does seem to be bugged, where his Clintar buff is meant to be coming back like every 10 or 14 seconds or something like that, but it just doesn't. So the wording on that text is quite weird, but I'm quite sure that when I use Shrug of Champions, for instance, against Anti-Venom, I still get that debuff placed to me every 10 or 14 seconds. So I'm not entirely sure what's happening here with Anti-Venom. I'm just quite sure that it's not quite meant to function the way we see it here. And yeah, as an end result, Void definitely is much better for this than Anti-Venom is. But it's primarily because, for whatever reason, Anti-Venom Clintar's buff is not coming back like at all. Otherwise, I think it would be much closer contest. Now, this fight is going to be dealing with Buffet. But interestingly enough, both of them, Void and Anti-Venom, have the same weakness against Buffet, which is it's quite hard to trigger that dexterity when you dash back, because they have fairly similar dashbacks, and Void has like notoriously long dashback, where against certain opponents it's virtually impossible to trigger that dexterity buff. Now, there is also 200% Energize on this node, and Do Not Go Gentle and everything else that obviously makes these fights kind of much harder to take on. However, one cool thing Anti-Venom has, yet again, is that ability to virtually tank everything in his block without needing to, you know, dance around too much, and thus also getting extra power. I think, you know, for most of the fight here, Anti-Venom is going to be leading. At the very end, I think Void is kind of gonna finish up the quicker here, but it's also largely gonna be because of the AI, where the Anti-Venom's Drax just will kind of freeze up in the place. But again, when it comes to dealing with Buffet, both of those champions are absolutely amazing, because neither one of them rely on buffs. Only buffs that they would have access to would be the dexterity buff, so both of them would have to trigger dexterity. But it's also important that Buffet would never at any point kind of interfere in any functionality of the either champion, because they don't have any natural buffs at all. And obviously both of them are very potent at reversing regeneration, you know, to a very high degree and margin. And yeah, so when it comes to dealing with Buffet node specifically, I think, you know, pretty much both of them are about the same, like we can see here. Void just finished the fight, and Anti-Venom is still going on, but it's because he spent about 20 seconds baiting out a single special attack there at the end, and then one trigger there, you know, kind of equalizes that score, so there's not that much of a difference. As he said, if the difference is like 10-12%, then he doesn't give a point to either champion, unless in very kind of cup specific scenarios. And this fight is meant to kind of like measure the power control, and objectively, quite simply, because Void's petrifies are more potent, in plenty of situations, Void's power control is going to be the better one, because you will be able to neutralize and then completely reverse opponent's power gain faster and to a higher degree. However, there is additional piece of utility that comes in handy in specific matchups for Anti-Venom, and that is his stagger on level 1, because whenever a power gain buff is triggered by power gain effect is triggered by some sort of buff, Anti-Venom has an opportunity to actually place, you know, staggers on the opponent and thus nullify the buff completely, and working as an additional assist. So in realistic terms, I'd say Void has like generically more potent ability to reverse opponent's power gains, but at the same time I do think that Anti-Venom's stagger kind of offers a bit different spin on the versions of power control, because Power control is actually oversimplified term for many complex effects in this game. Like we have combat power rate, and for instance, neither one of these is particularly great to deal with that. Then we have, active power gain effects, passive power gain effects, and then, form of power gain or form power control might be necessary, for instance, when opponents have like economy on their special attacks, like we had in Eternity of Pain blade fights. So when we discuss power control, we often tend to oversimplify it. And this fight's very interesting because I do believe this is from Act 6 or 7 somewhere, where basically when Science Champions use a special attack, they enervate the opponent, and that enervate is refreshed by consuming one debuff every X amount of seconds. And then every X amount of seconds, the opponents also gain like a power gain effect. So this is kind of like a node to see which of these champions is just more capable of placing many debuffs on the opponents. And in this kind of type of situation, Anti-Venom seems to be getting the job done easier because he doesn't only place the debuffs on opponent with his, combo meter building, but he also has the staggers that can stack up to 2 on his heavy attack, so that's more extra debuffs on demand. And then obviously he gets his extra petrifies on his level 1s as well. And overall, when it comes strictly to the amount of debuffs and the speed in which you can place debuffs on the opponent, then Anti-Venom would take the W there, because obviously Void has a very kind of like set in stone timer, and then your level 1s and level 2s. Anti-Venom has like an extra source of that because, every heavy hit can place a debuff, and then whenever you reach a combo of 10. So here we can see that the difference in time is, for this fight as well, fairly significant right here. So the Anti-Venom would take the W here in this situation, in my opinion. And yeah, that hood is about to go down in a few seconds as well. He finally gets that Fear of the Void active there, and the last few kind of seconds. Right, so that much sorted there. We need to move on to the next fight. And the next fight is going to be against Venom, but which node they are going to be testing against here. This is the Power Sting path. So both of these champions have been equipped with Mr. Fantastic Synergy. Again, just to check which one of them kind of deals better with those Power Sting lanes where you always have an opportunity to use any Science Champions if you run Mr. Fantastic and She-Hulk. And in this case, I think both of the champions are going to score pretty much similarly, even though Anti-Venom realistically ought to have like a somewhat of a better time, because you do have your base, you do have your damage multiplier here in forms of level 2 Furies, and those Power Stings are getting more potent with your increase in attack rating. But he did make a small mistake there as well, but overall, even that small mistake kind of being ignored, there isn't going to be kind of like big enough of a difference. Anti-Venom finishes up here, and at the same point, Venom is pretty much dead, a few seconds later. So you could argue that you could give that one to Anti-Venom, but I think neither champion got the point there in his own little scoring system. And here, I know that there are two different opponents, but the health pools are virtually the same, and the nodes are virtually the same. I think he just didn't want to redo the path to get to these fights. Because, yeah, the nodes are the same, the health pools are pretty much the same. It's the Footloose that they have to deal with, both of them. And this lane also has stun vulnerability, which in theory should give Void bigger advantage, because every time you parry, you get that 200% damage increase. And you can see that Void's debuff damage also immediately goes through the roof. And that definitely kind of gives a little bit of an extra edge, extra benefit to Void specifically. But on the other hand, Anti-Venom does not only have his Deaccelerate to work with, which eventually basically turns into slow. He also has his staggers, so he can deal with the evades and unstoppable effects there by staggering them if need be. And obviously Void doesn't really have that much to deal with the unstoppables, even though he does have that ability that reduces opponent's evade chance. It's just nowhere near as kind of potent as Deaccelerate that Anti-Venom has. So when it comes to dealing with evade specifically, Anti-Venom is the better champion, because Void's evade ability accuracy reduction isn't quite as potent as Anti-Venom's Deaccelerate. And then on top of it, in situations of Footloose, obviously Anti-Venom still has the stagger that he can utilize. Now, this fight is borderline unfair. If I was Ankit, I would not have included this one, because, well, first of all, it kind of seems silly to use special attacks against Miles, and, you know, because it's a full-on RNG whether you can hit or not. But the second thing is that, obviously, Anti-Venom has the Clintar buff, and if you are... The point was to test out against Mesmerize here, how both of these champions can deal with Mesmerize, more or less. But, obviously, Anti-Venom is one of those champions that shuts down the evade of Spider-Verse heroes, so he does have kind of like an infinite advantage. So I do think that, you know, the fights up until now were basically where both champions kind of had pretty much of an equal setup and equal right to be in these fights. The fights that are going to be past this point, I do feel that Ankit is slightly setting up Void for failure, because Anti-Venom does have extra pieces of utility that Void doesn't. Like, Anti-Venom does have an extra immunity, as shown here. He can, you know, completely shut down Spider-Verse hero effects. Then also Anti-Venom has Disorients that at max effect reduce opponent's defensive ability accuracy by up to about 70-something%, which again is something that Void can't do. And there will be kind of like matches that showcase some of those things. Again, that is his personal scoring system. I personally think the end results are, you know, somewhat a bit more tied up to this point, in between Void and or Anti-Venom. I do think they both kind of did their jobs extremely well. And past this point, it's going to be basically utilization of effects that Void doesn't really have, but can kind of deal those fights due to extra circumstances. Like in this fight, for instance, this is Gimme Lane, and obviously against Gimme Lane, Anti-Venom again does have extra advantage here, especially if you kind of perhaps ought to eat some attacks in the face on purpose here with Anti-Venom, not just block the special attacks, because your regen constantly is going to be in the background and enabling you to do more damage. And the most critical thing is that you should never be at full bar of power, because then your damage kind of like just doesn't work. So you should just probably start this fight by eating a combo or something. But yeah, in theory, obviously, Anti-Venom is much better champion for Gimme Lanes than Venom would be. But because of that power sting interaction and willpower regen, basically Void can deal with Gimme Lane, you know, just as well. So he kind of defeated the purpose here, but that's because he used Anti-Venom slightly incorrectly. He should have just eaten, you know, few hits in the face at the beginning of the fight and then started playing whatever he was doing, and, you know, everything would have been fine. Just tank a heavy attack or something. But yeah, so here basically they all both finish virtually simultaneously, so he leaves the score the same. Now this fight is to showcase Hazard Shift compatibility. This is one of the Act 7 lanes where you kind of, the entire lane was virtually built for these Science Champions. That this node also has, for instance, buffet, but Science Champions are immune to it. And also whenever Science Champions trigger an immunity, they gain, you know, a whole bunch of Furies that increase their damage quite significantly, which obviously also quite drastically benefits Void, because as soon as you get some of the debuffs going and you start putting passive Furies on yourself, you can see that dealing like 4,000 damage over time with Void's debuffs. So both of them do excellent, but obviously the extra immunity that Anti-Venom had here basically meant that Anti-Venom did not have to wait out the poison phase of Hazard Shift, and that was extremely helpful. Now, here one of the cool things about Anti-Venom, well, both Void and Anti-Venom are very good against Bishop. We can agree on that, 100%. Both of them are definitely very good champions. However, Anti-Venom does have somewhat of an advantage here in this fight, because A, you can be more confident in taking special attacks on your block, and also B, thanks to your Disorients, you can see that Bishop isn't really getting his prowess effects, at the very least, and nowhere near the rate that he would be in most of the matchups. The Disorient is preventing Bishop from gaining prowess in like half of the hits, if not more. And as an end result of that, we can see that, you know, life's good. You don't need to worry about those special attacks going unblockable. Obviously, both champions are incinerate immune, and then you can just nuke them down. So both of them are actually very, very, very good bishop counters. Now, this fight is meant to be a showcase of which champion basically kind of deals with Dr. Doom's aura better and Dr. Doom's toolkit. And again, I do think he kind of tips the scales here in the favor of the Void. I would have given Void a point for this fight just for being purely faster because of Void's damage over time effects and him being able to consistently deal damage in the background, and the fact that Doom is tank and otherwise doesn't take all that much damage. You know, Void is going to finish this fight definitely quicker. But at the same time, I do have to agree that I think this fight is safer with Anti-Venom, because you can see that even if you don't have that slow active, you do fail the unblockable of Dr. Doom, and there's very little to worry about with either of the champions, to be honest. So I definitely 100% would have given a point to Void here, personally, in this fight, I think. But I do think that Anti-Venom is arguably slightly safer, but he definitely took, you know, somewhat of a longer time here. And here are two Anti-Venom fights back to back, because Anti-Venom on the bottom fight has the Spider-Man 2099 synergy, which basically gives him kind of like a mysterious soul imprisonment thing where opponents don't have buffs. And then you can just have staggers up by the end of it and make sure that that Electro never regenerates. This is that nasty 1% regeneration Act 6 Electro, and Poison 1% regeneration Electro. And he's basically using two different strategies to deal with this Void. One of them is largely relying on Disorients to take a lot less damage from Electro back whenever you hit, because at the max potency, once you hit about 50 in your combo meter, your Disorients do reduce the opponent's defensive ability accuracy for about 70-something%. Now, it's not huge, it's not the best ability accuracy reduction by a long shot, but still, 7 out of 10 hits, not taking back damage from Electro is quite neat. And in the other fight, you know, he's much more focused at basically reversing that Electro's regeneration and just trying to take as little damage as possible. Now, both times he obviously has to deal with that do not go gentle node, but we can see that in this case, you know, it's two completely different ways how to get the fight done. But using the Spider-Man 2099 synergy was actually somewhat worse off, because Anti-Venom was better off benefiting from that regeneration that he could reverse. But it is, again, additional nice piece of utility where Anti-Venom, you know, has that stagger, has that ability to shut down buffs on the opponent from the very beginning of the fight, which is quite unique. Now, this is a Tantrum lane, which again is fairly specific, and you just need to have access to very specific debuffs in order to be able to do this lane well, at the very least. Any champion technically can do this lane, but you would always have to deal with 50% damage reduction unless you knock the opponents down. But in order to do that, you would have to deal with Tantrum node, which basically means having like Disorient active on opponent or something, or Concussion. And the cool thing is, obviously, that Anti-Venom does have that access to Disorient. Now, other than that, it's, you know, fairly straightforward fight. The one good thing that he is showcasing in here is that Anti-Venom always does have the weakness that he cannot really escape. That is that in order for the damage, you do have to sacrifice some of your utility. You do have to sacrifice your debuffs. However, whenever you drop your special attack at like 9, as long as you don't have the max ramp up on before launching that special attack, and then you drop your special at like 79 hits, for instance, or 89 hits, you kind of regain a slight amount of your utility back, or at the very least, in this case, enough not to suffer from Tantrum, because you can use your level 2, and because as soon as your first hit of the special attack connects, you cross a combo of 10, and you immediately gain at the very least 1 debuff back, which is obviously enough in this case to bypass Tantrum. It is definitely Anti-Venom's biggest weakness, but, you know, it's one of those things where with a slight bit of quick thinking, you can kind of, you know, reduce the harmful effects at the very least slowly, but it's still a problem. Now, here is just a showcase how, you know, typically you wouldn't use Anti-Venom as a counter to Kitty, because there are better counters without a doubt. But one of the cool things is here, obviously, that, well, even if you do mess up, then Anti-Venom is Incinerate immune, which does make it slightly safer. B, he doesn't have the greatest crit rate, so Kitty wouldn't be gaining that many prowess charges anyways. But most importantly here, what he is showcasing is that when you do get your combo meter up and when you do inflict the disorients on the Kitty Pride, at that point she hardly gains her prowesses as well, and it's much easier to control her. Now obviously Kitty is definitely a beatable opponent with virtually any champion if you kind of corner her and stay super aggressive. But at the same time, the fact that, you know, as we can see here, she hardly gains any prowess effect is just kind of like a super useful thing where, again, one of those things where you do not necessarily think that Disorient could be as useful of ability as potentially can be, but we have showcased against Bishop, we have showcased against Kitty Pride, where, you know, I in past had never particularly thought about using Disorient champs, for instance, against Bishop or Kitty, but hey, it does seem to be making quite big of a difference in these fights. And then the last thing, I think, oh, here he wanted to showcase that once you reach 30 combo meter, you basically fail Mystic Champion unblockables, which obviously can be super useful. Here, you know, because he's under 30 combo, sometimes he fails them, sometimes he doesn't. But as soon as you reach 30 hit combo meter, you can see that you completely fail all of the Mystic Champion unblockable effects. And the cool thing that he mentioned there is it also does affect unblockable finale, for instance, and nodes otherwise. And that can definitely, you know, create some very unique and interesting situations. Here in this case, he wanted to showcase that Anti-Venom can kind of make other champions spend the entire fight without any buffs active at all. If you start with that Spidey 99 synergy, which obviously makes them buff immune for the first 10 seconds of the fight or so on. And then for the rest of the time, you can just keep on staggering virtually everything. And as far as science champions go, he's pretty much only science champion that can kind of behave in a similar fashion of a mystic champion as well. It's one of the, you know, credit marks that we often give to CGR, who does have like a legitimately decent buff control as a cosmic champion, and Anti-Venom has it as well. But yeah, and that is pretty much it. I do genuinely think that Anti-Venom is a champion that's only kind of gonna raise in, you know, people's opinion over time type of champion, because he does have a ton of abilities. He has some inherent weaknesses and annoyances to run him, but yeah, many champions that Kabam has released over the course of like last year or so are very easily to be fairly unimpressed with upon their release. But then, you know, people kind of grow more accustomed to them, find them to be more useful than they initially thought. And I think Anti-Venom is, you know, just one of the latest champions where people kind of are following the same footsteps of, I don't know, Mr. Negative and Overseer and so on and so forth. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys think. And yeah, huge thank you to Ankit. I'll leave a link to his original video in the description. I'll catch you guys soon. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the